Two people are, mathematically, enough to restart the human race. In practice, it would mean founding humanity's most inbred family tree, on purpose, with no way out. Start with the basic biology. Every person carries two copies of nearly every gene, one inherited from each parent. Most of the versions that could actually hurt someone are recessive, meaning they only cause a problem if both copies happen to be the harmful one. Spread across a large, diverse population, the odds of that pairing up are low, because different people rarely carry the exact same rare, recessive gene. Think of each hidden harmful gene as a single losing lottery ticket printed in one copy and quietly mixed into an otherwise healthy hand. In a population of billions, the odds of two strangers holding a matching losing ticket are close to nothing. Shrink that population down to two people and everyone descended from them, and there is nowhere left for the population to hide from a mistake in its own genes. Every future child would be drawn from an increasingly small, repeating gene pool, matched against relatives instead of strangers. History already has a preview of what happens when a gene pool refuses to widen, and it did not need an apocalypse to produce it. The Spanish branch of the Habsburg dynasty spent generations marrying uncles to nieces and first cousins to each other, on purpose, specifically to keep the throne inside the family. The strategy worked in the narrow sense that the crown stayed put. It also produced Charles II of Spain, whose jaw was so pronounced from generations of repeated genetics that he reportedly struggled to chew, who suffered from infertility and a long list of health problems, and who died without an heir, ending the entire Spanish Habsburg line in one generation. Researchers who later calculated his inbreeding coefficient, a number estimating how much of his genome came from identical ancestors on both sides of his family, found it comparable to what would be expected from a child of siblings. A royal family with enormous resources, choosing this path deliberately over centuries, still could not outmanage the genetics. Two accidental survivors would be starting from a position considerably worse than that. So what actually happens to a bloodline that stays this small for generations, without royal doctors or modern medicine to soften the fall? History does not need to guess, because it has already run something close to this experiment on ordinary people too. On the Pacific island of Pingalop, a massive typhoon in the 1700s wiped out nearly the entire population, leaving as few as 20 survivors. One of them happened to carry a rare gene for total colorblindness. 2 centuries later, roughly 1 in 10 Pingalopese islanders is born completely colorblind, seeing the world only in shades of gray, a condition found almost nowhere else on the planet at that frequency. A single missing survivor could have erased that gene from the island forever. A single surviving carrier locked it into the population's genetic code for centuries. That is what a bottleneck actually does. It does not just shrink a population, it shrinks the range of futures that population is still allowed to have. How many people would it actually take to avoid becoming a real-life Pingalap, generation after generation? Surely more than 2, but how many more? 10, spread across a couple of generations, would still be running on the same handful of genetic starting cards as 2, just dealt out a few more times. 50 starts to sound safer until the math underneath it gets examined closely. Conservation biologists have a working answer, developed mostly for endangered animals rather than the entire human species. But the math does not care about the species involved. It is known as the 5500 rule. 50 individuals are considered the rough floor needed to survive the short term without collapsing under inbreeding depression. The measurable decline in health, fertility, and survival that shows up when close relatives keep breeding with each other. 500 is closer to what is needed for the long term, enough genetic variety for natural selection to keep working, and for the population to adapt as its environment inevitably changes. 2 people do not meet either number. 2 people are not a population. 2 people are a rounding error, wearing a population's clothes. For context, most estimates of how large ancestral human hunter-gatherer bands actually were land somewhere between 25 and a couple hundred people, with anthropologist Robin Dunbar proposing that roughly 150 represents the natural ceiling on how many stable social relationships a single human brain can comfortably track, a figure now generally known as Dunbar's number. Bands relied on regularly exchanging members with neighboring groups, especially through marriage, specifically to avoid the same bottleneck problem now being run in reverse. A species that evolved expecting regular contact with outside groups was never built to function on an internal population of 2. Even 50, or 500, undersells the real complication, because raw headcount is not actually the number that matters most. Population geneticists separate the census population, the number of bodies a person could physically count, from something called effective population size, the number of individuals actually contributing genetic material to the next generation in a stable, balanced way. A group can have thousands of members and still have a tiny effective population size if only a handful of them are the ones actually reproducing. Some researchers have proposed that humanity itself passed through a genetic bottleneck roughly 70,000 years ago, possibly tied to a catastrophic volcanic eruption, with an effective population that may have dropped into the low thousands. The theory is still debated, and the fossil evidence is messier than any headline about it lets on. But the genetic fingerprint left behind is real. Modern humans, all 8 billion of them, carry less genetic diversity than a single troop of chimpanzees living in one forest. Everyone alive today is, on some level, still living downstream of a very close call. Which raises the obvious follow-up question. If a population that small nearly ended the species once, purely by accident, could 2 people, on purpose, ever rebuild something stable? Technically, yes. In the same sense that flipping a coin 50 times and landing on heads every single time is technically possible. It would take generation after generation of careful, deliberate pairing, spreading reproduction across siblings, cousins, and eventually far more distantly related descendants, all while trying to keep the same handful of harmful genes from stacking up in the same bodies twice. The family tree would stop looking like a tree. Branches meant to stay separate for hundreds of years would loop back and touch each other within 2 or 3 generations instead. It would stop being a tree and start being a wreath, every branch eventually curling back to meet every other branch, because there would be nowhere else left for the lines to grow. The same math has already been run for a very different reason: interplanetary colonization. Anthropologists and geneticists studying what it would take to send a self-sustaining crew to Mars, or aboard a generation ship bound for another star, have proposed numbers far higher than 2 and considerably higher than 50. One widely cited estimate puts the figure at around 160 people, specifically chosen and paired across generations, as the rough minimum needed to maintain enough genetic diversity for a multi-century voyage without deliberate genetic management along the way. Other estimates run into the low thousands, depending on how many generations the mission is expected to last before reaching a destination with a larger population to rejoin. 2 people is not a rounding error away from these numbers. 2 people is off the chart entirely, several orders of magnitude short of what serious researchers consider survivable without outside intervention. And even if the pairing problem were somehow solved perfectly, there is still a second question nobody wants to run the numbers on. How long would it actually take 2 people to become 8 billion again? Left alone with abundant resources, human population has historically been able to roughly double every 25 to 30 years. Getting from 2 people back to 8 billion is not a 2 or 3 generation project. It works out to roughly 33 doublings, which lands somewhere around 800 years of uninterrupted, disaster-free, disease-free growth. Realistically, almost nothing about that stays uninterrupted. Famine, disease, war, and the same inbreeding depression already sitting underneath the population from Generation 1 would very likely stretch that timeline out much further if they did not stop it outright. There is also a much more basic bottleneck sitting underneath all of this, one that has nothing to do with genetics at all. Human biology only allows one woman to carry so many pregnancies across an entire reproductive lifetime. Even in exceptionally well-documented historical cases of unusually high fertility, women rarely carried more than 15 or so pregnancies to term across several decades. And the realistic average, once spacing between births, illness, and a roughly 9-month pregnancy each time are accounted for, sits far lower than that. For the entire first generation, with only one woman capable of giving birth at all, population growth would crawl along one child at a time, years apart, long before there were enough people alive to even attempt the kind of doubling curve possible later on. The genetics problem and the fertility problem would be running at the same time, compounding each other for decades before either one showed real signs of easing. None of this means small populations are automatically doomed, though. Conservation biology has a genuine counterexample, and it is a hopeful one. By 1987, the entire world population of California condors had crashed to 22 birds, all of them in captivity, driven to the edge by lead poisoning and habitat loss. Wildlife geneticists did not simply let the birds breed however they pleased. They built a stud book, tracking every bird's ancestry in careful detail, and paired individuals specifically to minimize how related each new pairing was, spreading the surviving bloodlines out as evenly as possible instead of letting the closest relatives breed by chance. Decades later, the wild population numbers in the hundreds. Still fragile, but no longer circling extinction. Black-footed ferrets went through an even narrower squeeze, rebuilding an entire species from just 7 surviving founders using the same deliberate, unromantic genetic bookkeeping. 2 accidental human survivors would have no stud book, no geneticist assigning partners, and no institutional memory of who was related to whom past a generation or two. The condors and the ferrets did not survive because their populations were large. They survived because someone was doing the specific, tedious math the 2 founders scenario would have no one left alive to do. Real founder populations, built from small starting numbers rather than exactly 2, show how this plays out even in the cases that mostly worked. Biologists call the genetic signature left behind by a small starting group the founder effect, and it shows up decades or centuries later in populations that otherwise look completely ordinary. The descendants of the bounty mutineers who settled Pitcairn Island came from roughly 25 founders, and their small, closed gene pool is still measurable in the population today. Certain Amish and Mennonite communities, founded by a few hundred settlers who deliberately kept marrying within the group, now show unusually high rates of specific genetic disorders that are vanishingly rare everywhere else, simply because the founding gene pool never grew wide enough to dilute them back out. A similar pattern shows up in Ashkenazi Jewish populations, whose ancestry traces back to a relatively small group in medieval Europe before centuries of persecution and displacement kept the community largely marrying within itself. Geneticists studying that history can point to specific inherited conditions, such as Tay-Sachs disease, that occur at a measurably higher rate in that population than in the general public, not because of anything unique about the culture, but because of the same founder math playing out again on a larger, slower timescale. On the remote island of Tristan da Cunha in the South Atlantic, one of the most isolated inhabited places on Earth, the entire modern population descends from a founding group of fewer than 20 settlers. Today, the island has an unusually high rate of asthma and a rare inherited eye disorder called retinitis pigmentosa, both traceable back to specific carriers among those original founders, still surfacing generations later simply because there was nowhere else on the island for new genetic material to come from. None of these populations started from 2 people. All of them still carry a visible signature of having started small. 2 founders would not produce a mild version of that signature. 2 founders would produce the most extreme version currently on record, running at full strength, indefinitely. Here's the part that usually gets missed. The danger was never really about inbreeding itself, in the way most people picture it. The danger is about what inbreeding reveals rather than what it creates. 2 closely related parents do not manufacture new harmful genes out of nothing. They simply raise the odds that whatever harmful genes were already quietly hiding, one copy each in otherwise healthy carriers, finally get paired up and switched on. Most people alive today are estimated to carry somewhere between 1 and a handful of these hidden, potentially harmful, recessive variants without ever knowing it, purely because they have never partnered with someone who happened to carry the exact same one. 2 founders do not add new risk to a species. 2 founders remove the species' ability to dilute the risk it already quietly carries. Humans, it turns out, evolved a built-in alarm system for exactly this problem, one that runs in the background without anyone consciously tracking gene frequencies. It is called the Westermarck effect, named after the Finnish anthropologist who first documented it. Children raised in close physical proximity from a young age, even when they are not biologically related, tend to develop a strong sexual aversion to each other later in life. It shows up in studies of Israeli kibbutzim, where unrelated children raised together in the same peer group almost never marry each other as adults, and in a now abandoned custom from parts of Taiwan, where a future daughter-in-law was raised inside her husband's household from childhood, a practice later shown to produce measurably lower fertility and higher divorce rates than marriages between strangers. The instinct does not know or care about DNA. It only tracks who grew up down the hall. It is evolution's rough, blunt patch for a bug it could never fully fix on its own. Cultures arrived at a similar conclusion independently, long before anyone had access to genetics. Anthropologists studying societies across every inhabited continent have found some version of an incest taboo in nearly all of them, alongside deliberate customs pushing marriage outward, exchange between neighboring groups, arranged unions with distant clans, or strict rules dictating exactly which cousins counted as acceptable partners and which did not. These rules were rarely explained in genetic terms, since nobody involved had ever heard of a recessive allele. They were explained in terms of alliance, obligation, and taboo instead. The outcome, whether or not anyone intended it, was the same outward pressure the Westermarck effect creates on an individual, scaled up into law and custom across an entire society. 2 founders would be cut off from all of it. No neighboring clan to marry into, no outside bloodline to fold in, nothing left but each other, and, eventually, everyone descended from each other. Modern life has, mostly by accident, solved the outward pressure problem at a scale no ancient band could have imagined. Global travel, migration, and dating pools that stretch across cities, countries, and continents mean most people today draw potential partners from millions of unrelated strangers rather than the same few dozen families down the road. It is easy to take for granted, but it represents close to the exact opposite condition of the two founders scenario. Instead of an effective population size collapsing toward 2, much of the modern world now has access to one of the largest, most genetically open mating pools the species has ever had. The instinct that once relied on a neighboring clan a day's walk away now works at the scale of an entire connected planet, quietly doing the same job it always did, just with far more strangers to choose from. So picture the two founders again, further out this time. Not the first uncomfortable generation, but the 5th or the 10th, spread across a slowly widening web of descendants who no longer even realize they are cousins 6 times removed. The instinct built to prevent close inbreeding is still quietly running underneath all of it, nudging people toward whoever feels least familiar, whoever grew up furthest away, whoever looks least like the reflection in the mirror. On its own, that instinct will never be enough to solve a species-wide bottleneck, but it is a strange kind of proof that biology has been quietly bracing for this exact scenario for a very long time, long before anyone wrote down the math to explain why, which is really the point the two founders' scenario keeps circling back to. It was never just a survival puzzle about food, shelter, or predators, the kind every apocalypse story fixates on. It is a genetics puzzle, running quietly in the background, on a timescale that outlasts every dramatic part of the story. The Habsburgs had the wealth of an empire behind them, and it did not save the line. The Condors had nothing but 22 birds, a stud book, and people willing to do the tedious math, and it was enough to save the species instead. 2 people are enough to keep a heartbeat going. They are not enough to keep a species going. Not without generations of careful, uncomfortable math that nobody signed up to run. The species would not fail in year 1, or even year 10. It would fail slowly and invisibly instead, one recessive gene finally pairing up with itself at a time, until a wreath of a family tree finally ran out of new directions left to grow.